How the first trade wars began, long before borders, before flags, before money, human survival depended on movement. Food spoiled, resources ran out, and the land changed. So, people moved, and when people moved, they met others. This is where trade was born, not from trust but from distance. In the earliest human societies, trade wasn't about profit, it was about access. Access to food during a drought, access to materials not found locally, access to survival itself. Groups exchanged what they had for what they lacked. Stone for grain, salt for tools, protection for safe passage. There were no markets, no prices, no contracts. Only balance, and if you took too much, that balance broke. As populations grew, so did specialization. Some regions produced more food, others controlled metal, and others sat right in the middle of crucial routes. Trade routes emerged not as lines on a map but as repeated paths. Paths that became predictable, and predictability creates value. The more predictable the route, the more powerful those who controlled it became. This control wasn't enforced with laws, it was enforced with presence. Who guarded the path? Who taxed the crossing? Who allowed passage? Suddenly, trade was no longer just an exchange. It became leverage, and leverage creates tension. The moment a group depended on a specific route, that route became a target. The first trade wars didn't begin with armies. They began with blockades. A path closed, a crossing denied, a resource withheld. There was no big battle, no dramatic announcement. Just absence, and absence is a powerful thing. When trade stopped, people noticed, food became scarce, tools became expensive, and survival became uncertain. This was the first economic weapon: control the supply, and you control behavior. As trade networks expanded, so did competition. Multiple groups wanted the same route, the same port, the same crossing. Trade created winners and left others behind. Inequality appeared not between individuals but between entire regions. Some places grew rich without producing a single thing, they just controlled the movement. We often imagine early wars as chaotic, random violence, but the first trade wars were calculated. They were about small raids, targeted disruptions, and strategic pressure. The goal wasn't to destroy, but to dominate. It wasn't conquest, it was compliance. This is when trade and war became inseparable. Protection required force, force required resources, and resources required trade. This feedback loop defined early power structures. The strongest groups weren't necessarily the most violent. They were the most strategic, they understood flow. Before money existed, payment was control. Control of land, control of passage, control of time. If you wanted to trade, you submitted. If you resisted, you were isolated. And isolation was often worse than defeat. As trade intensified, especially between strangers, trust began to decline. Trade between strangers requires guarantees, and guarantees require enforcement. Enforcement, of course, requires force, and so war professionalized. It was no longer a spontaneous, emotional outburst, it became organized and economic. The first organized armies didn't protect people, they protected trade routes. Soldiers guarded caravans, ports, and storage sites. Violence became an investment. These trade wars completely reshaped societies, leadership changed. Power shifted from the village elders to those who controlled logistics. The trader became as important as the warrior, sometimes even more so. As trade routes stretched across vast regions, so did conflicts. A disruption in one place could affect many others down the line. This interconnectedness amplified tension. Small conflicts spiraled into large ones, not because of hatred, but because of dependency. Trade promised prosperity, but what it delivered was fragility. The more connected societies became, the more vulnerable they were. A single route failure could collapse an entire system. To reduce this uncertainty, groups sought permanence. Permanent control, permanent dominance. This is where expansion began, not for glory, but for stability. Conquest was simply justified as protection. Trade wars normalized violence, conflict was no longer an exception. It became a core feature of the system. Economic systems adapted. War budgets, supply chains, resource planning, the very foundations of state power were built on this new reality. Without money, war was paid through obligation. Farmers had to feed soldiers, and entire communities had to support military campaigns. Debt was collective. Victory meant a redistribution of resources. Defeat meant a redistribution of suffering. As these systems grew, so did the scale of conflict. Trade wars evolved into territorial wars. But the motivation always remained the same: control the flow, control the resources, control the people. Even when money finally emerged, the logic didn't change. Money replaced obligation, but power still followed the roots. Today, we see trade wars as a modern phenomenon: tariffs, sanctions, blockades. But the structure is ancient. The first trade wars weren't about ideology. They were about survival through control. They shaped how our societies organized, how power was consolidated, and how violence became a normal part of economic life. Trade created connection, connection created dependency, and dependency created conflict. This cycle never ended, it only became more complex. So, when we ask how the first trade wars began, the answer is simple. They began the moment trade became necessary and control became possible. Perhaps the real question isn't why trade leads to war. The real question is, can a system built on control ever truly remain peaceful?